You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Professor Eric Dumbaugh of Florida Atlantic University to discuss his new paper on land use and road safety. We discuss the connections between the siting of destinations and the deaths of vulnerable road users, as well as the long-term planning needed for road safety. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of bus riders, bus drivers, and chupistas, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. And if you want to just give a single $1 a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with 0 outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to get the show in your podcatcher. We'll also recently put up some bonus material, including audio of my first ever e-bike ride, and have a weekly free post from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, get your heavyweight bus and bike scarves. You'll definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, just to show everyone in that city hall or legislature your advocacy in clothing that won't get taken by security on the way in. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. But there are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from us on the bookshop site, either the books from our authors that we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the 20-year-old newsletter we do at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 110,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes as well for that one too. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that as well. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up for you in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements on gatherings, but for now, just enjoy the show. Hey everybody, I decided to move this part of my thank yous up from the post-credits to right here smack dab at the start because I do want to recognize the folks who are Dallas tier or higher Patreon supporters. It really helps us out and we super appreciate it. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. So first names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mal, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Matthew, Sylvia, and recently added Andrew A. All right, thank you all very much. Let's get to the show. Eric Dumbaugh, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am a professor of urban and regional planning at Florida Atlantic University. I've been working in the area of road safety for about 25 years. I have a sort of non-traditional background for this domain. I have a PhD in civil engineering, master's degrees in planning and civil engineering, and then an undergraduate degree in English literature.
Nice.
So I got interested in street design and how it relates to cities, and that sort of gravitated into road safety to start to realize how the environments we build can encourage or discourage people from getting injured or killed. So I've been doing that since about 1999.
What switched you from English literature to this focus on streets and safety and all that stuff?
So, this is the mid-90s. I was working, as a lot of people were, in tech then. I was working for one of the first fleet management companies that were connecting Garmin GPS units to vehicles, livery vehicles throughout the Northeast. So I was traveling on New York, New Jersey, these areas. I spent a lot of time in different cities and a lot of time traveling between them to get this technology working. And I became very interested in the cities themselves and the movement in it. And then during some of my commuting there, a fellow by the name of William White passed away. And as I spent so much time in the car, I got to hear after he died, they played an interview with him on Fresh Air. And I was in the car so long that I not only heard the original airing, but the repeat airing. So I was in the car a long time that day. I heard it twice, and it got me thinking about design and cities and streets and public spaces. I was fascinated by that, and it just sort of gravitated into what I'm doing now.
That's awesome. And then you got involved with the New Urbanists and that movement as well at some point too.
Yeah, so when John Norquist was running the Congress for New Urbanism, he was very interested in transportation. And I got hooked up with him. So when he was president of CNU, I was engaged with a lot of his transportation reform activities. And so that's what got me into the New Urbanist group.
Cool.
So I worked with him on road safety stuff they were interested in. We did an unsuccessful, very fun project to try to get that portion of I-10 that runs through Claiborne and New Orleans torn out. So I got to work with them on that. And I've been involved with the organization since.
Did you work on the fire department stuff? I can't remember
Yep.
if you were part of that too. Okay, that's what
part of that too.
Yeah,
yes.
Those fire departments, they're always getting in the way of good urbanism and good streets.
Well, to their defense now, I think it was a learning process on both sides because they actually had a really valid claim about response times. The first things that we often think about is, why are they taking these big trucks and why do these trucks have such physical demands? But your first responders for most medical events are actually going to be your fire departments because their proximity is closer. And so we're like, well, why do you need a ladder truck to handle a heart attack? And it's, well, a lot of the times we're not going to the station and back. We're going from, the cardiac event to a fire to somebody else. So they'll have multiple stops on there. Something like 15, 20% of all of their trips were like that. And so it was a learning process on both sides, and they have unique demands. Now, the fire departments are very much into connected street networks. They innately get that. So if you want an advocate for connecting your street network, building connectivity and the pedestrian benefits of that, the fire department's your friend. They're just going to make you put that, 20-foot clear on the street. So you're going to have to accept, the 20-foot clear on the right of way there. They said they would be fine with that if we would put residential sprinklers in everyone's homes, that they would be fine with the response times with that. But the construction costs on that made that unrealistic. So, but yeah, I was part of that. It was a fun project.
Yeah, it's funny. Looking back here in San Francisco, we had an idea where we were going to put a plaza and we were going to cut off a street. One of the main opposition for that was the fire department. And so that put the kibosh on that. But it turned out okay because we ended up taking a parking lot that was owned by a church and making it into a town square, which is very popular now. It has the farmers market and everything going on. Well, we've got a new paper out, Land Use and Road Safety, Understanding the Persistence of Vulnerable Road User Deaths and Injuries. I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of the basics of what you found and why you were looking in this specific direction.
Yeah, so I've been examining street design issues now for 25 years. And there's a view, and it's a uniquely U.S. view, that street design is the big problem and that street design is the solution to all things. But I've also had a chance to work in Europe. I was working in Sweden, and for their arterial streets, their designs are indistinguishable from what we use in the United States. The lane widths, the design features are exactly the same. The difference is what we put along our streets, right? So the difference is not how we design the streets, but rather what we allow to occur along the streets. In Western Europe, which we often use as the model, we go on vacation and we see their cities and we say, oh, this is really rather lovely. We should have our streets designed like this. But we don't look at either side of the right of way. The streets that we're looking at are essentially pre-automobile streets. They're streets that were built in the Renaissance through the early industrial era. And then most of the growth and development in Europe stopped. They didn't have this post-war boom and growth. And even places like England and Germany that got bombed out in the Second World War, when it came time to rebuild after the Second World War, they didn't build American style. They did not build the stuff we built. They essentially rebuilt the urban fabric that they had. And they haven't had a lot of population growth since then. So when we start looking at street design solutions from Europe, what we need to understand is we're looking at a built environment context where the automobile is adapted into a pre-automobile form. The United States, it's totally different. Nearly all of our growth has happened since that Second World War. Right? We had in 1950, we had about 150 million people. Now we're at about 330 million. And all of that was built on an entirely different design model that came of age in the 1910s and 1920s that was centered around integrating automobile into the urban fabric. So the streets are neither good nor bad. The safety problem on the streets happens when we start programming activities on them and then different sorts of users start entering into them. So in the study, what I wanted to look at was, is the issue really street design? Is it speed? Or is there something else going on here? And what I found in the study is that after you control for land use, things like speed and geometric design don't really matter that much. What's going on is we're putting these land uses on either side of the street, and it's activating different activities there. So the way I like to think of this in a systems perspective is high-speed roads, we understand, are inherently hazardous in an impact, right? We've all seen the graphic where, your chance of surviving a 40-mile-per-hour crash is like or your chance of dying is 90%. We've all seen that. The question is, why is somebody walking there? They're not walking there in Sweden because there's nothing to walk to. All of those land uses are prohibited along their arterials. Like in Germany, they're prohibited by law. You can't build that stuff there. In the United States, our development model is we build the residential community as a cell, and then we export all of the other uses outside. And going back to Clarence Perry, right, where do we put these uses? Well, let's put them on the arterials, right? They want that traffic, so let's put them there. And it's their presence there that's then generating the hazard. Because once you put them there, you start drawing the activities to them. You draw the pedestrians to them. You draw the cyclists to them. You draw the cars in and out of the driveways. One of the things in a study I did about 15, 20 years ago now is that the factors in urban areas that are hazardous for pedestrians and cyclists are the same factors that are hazardous for motorists. Often here in the United States, we have this cars versus vulnerable users. The safety problem for these users is exactly the same, and it's the confluence of activities at these points. So the question then becomes, why are we putting these uses in these environments, right? And what do we do about that to retrofit it going forward? So the study is really, the argument that it's making here is we can pick on the engineers all we want, but the real problem is our land use plan. You know, the engineer, and I have a graphic I like in the article that I think does a good job of illustrating this. The traffic engineer was never tasked with city design. The traffic engineer was tasked with moving traffic. That was part of the configuration that came about in the 1920s and 30s. They go out and they build perfectly fine roads, rural roads, ex-urban roads that are indistinguishable from the European counterparts. The difference is our planners, our local economic development people, they get real excited about bringing in growth, and they're experiencing growth, and they channel it over these roads. So roads that are perfectly fine in an undeveloped context become developed. Think of them as a latent hazard, right? The speed is hazardous, but it's only hazard if it's activated. And when you put these land uses on there, when your local planner colors their land use map red and says, we're going to allow this development along here, they're activating that error. So it's going to bring people along these streets. It's going to generate activity. It's going to generate conflicts, and it's going to create deaths and injuries. It was always hazardous, but the hazard wasn't activated until we encouraged people to come to these locations. So it's not the one thing, it's the entire development paradigm.
That's pretty radical in terms of like what folks have been saying for quite a while, at least in the space that we run in, which is street speeds. The Vision Zero folks are always talking about design for the roads and stuff like that. It's intuitive. It makes intuitive sense to me that, you know, where you're going matters, specifically where you're putting a lot of these uses. But I'm curious, what got you to that space in terms of like kind of switching it around to think about the land uses versus the roads?
So I started my dissertation in 2005, dealt with street design. It dealt with the engineering theories that inform street design. Street trees was specifically what I was interested in. I've been looking at that for a while, but when you start really looking at streets and you deal in a substantive way, you see things, you see 10-foot lanes that are dangerous. You see 12-foot lanes that are perfectly safe. A lot of the narrative we have doesn't correspond with what's actually happening on the ground. When you start developing an evidence base, you know, I've had the good fortune of being able to travel around a lot and work with lots of different cities and see a lot of different things. You start realizing that some of the things that we assume are true aren't borne out in practice. So the question then becomes why? And again, I've always been interested in cities themselves. So it's not just been street design, it's how that street integrates with what's going on either side of it. And again, having the good fortune of having worked internationally and seeing how other people do things, you start to look at what are the real differences here. And you realize that the differences really aren't street design per se. The differences are the environments in which the streets operate. And so it's seeing these things over time and then starting to ask, well, why is this the case? What's the difference? That's sort of how I got here.
It's interesting. When I was back working in my old job, I wrote a paper called Destinations Matter. I presented at a TRB panel and everything. And one thing it told me was that, you know, the more office and commercial density you put around the end of a train station, then you'd get more ridership because ultimately that's where the people wanted to go. And then, you know, as Pushkarev and Zupan told us, if you put more residential density on the other side of the line, you get even more. And so that density and that access really makes people want to go to that area. And so when I was reading your paper, I was thinking kind of the same thing in terms of like, you're putting these gas stations, these big box stores, you're putting all these destinations in these places, and people want to get to those destinations. And so, you know, that's where the conflicts happen, right? That's where a lot of this stuff happens because of those destinations that they put places. So I think that's a very interesting parallel, thinking of like the discussion about access, destinations, and the conflicts that ensue.
Yeah, and it answers another question too. When you start looking at who gets killed and when they get killed or when they get hit, We know that lower income folks, minority populations are 3 to 4 times more likely to get injured or killed while walking and cycling than more affluent ones. The presumption we have is they're less likely to own an automobile, so they're more likely to walk to destinations, their exposure is higher. That's actually not true. When you start looking at National Household Travel Survey, the group that walks the most are our most affluent populations, right? In terms of the total mileage they walk, it's the highest. But the reason they walk is for recreational and exercise. They're walking their dogs. They're going around the block for exercise. They're not trying to get anywhere meaningful, right? So if their environment's unsafe, they can just get in their car and drive somewhere else. Or they can select a neighborhood that's safe to walk in. They're not trying to achieve anything. Lower income folks, interestingly, actually don't walk more than they do. And they make fewer trips. What happens when people lose access to a car is they don't walk more. They just take fewer trips and they rely on friends and family members. But when they do walk, they're not walking for recreation. They're walking for utilitarian purposes. They're walking because they need food. They're walking to the grocery store. They're walking to the drugstore. They're walking to the fast food restaurant. Lower income neighborhoods, they're walking to the gas stations because in food deserts, that's where you get your food. So they're walking to these destinations. And unlike in affluent areas where they can walk in their suburban community, they're walking to the arterial, right? And that's where they're getting hit. So we're drawing them to these environments that are inherently unsafe for them. The other thing that comes in is you'll see a lot about most pedestrians getting killed at night. And the least satisfying conclusion to that is the one that always pops up, which is, let's put in more streetlights. The one thing I'd like to see tested, I think this is it, is I think it's a function of exposure. Because the lower income populations are going to be accessing food destinations more often than not in the late afternoon and early evening, right? That's what we see here in South Florida when I did a study for Florida DOT. It may be true that lighting's a contributing factor, but exposure is going to be the big one. They're trying to access these destinations. It happens, after 6:30. So the exposure is happening there. The crashes are happening there, right? So that too is going to be a function of land use drawing people to environments that are unsafe. I think as much as lighting, it's exposure. So when we start looking at people and not just streets, but what are people doing and where are they doing? When are they doing? How are they doing them? That is sort of what the land use question starts to answer. And when you start to see that, suddenly all these pieces in the road safety picture sort of come together. Or take another one too, which is, traffic fatalities, they've been relatively flatlining. Motorists are getting safer. You're less likely to die when you drive, but our vehicle technologies are better. It's being offset by increases in pedestrian activity. You're safer in the car, but as you try to access these environments, if people feel increasingly financially crunched, they're going to be more likely to walk to these destinations. They're going to be more likely to get injured or killed. So I think land use is sort of the missing piece that sort of brings all the pieces together.
Makes me think of Wes Marshall's discussion about risk, right? The more you drive, the more risk you entertain. And so creates that exposure that you're talking about. Something to think about.
It's also where you drive, though. You're on a rural highway. You may run off the road in the middle of the night, but your per mile traveled risk is low. You go through a suburban arterial and it becomes very high. So risk is also relative to the hazard of the environment you're going into.
You looked specifically at arterial highways in Florida, and those ones, I know they come up pretty often as some of the worst ones in the country. Was this a factor in studying the specific types of places because of the kind of known quantity of traffic collisions and things like that?
Partly yes and partly no. So I grew up in Florida. I've lived most of my life here. I left for college. I came back down when I was 40. I innately know this. So Florida has always been my baseline for understanding how cities work, for good or ill. I think Florida is the best case because more than most other states, it's really been ground zero for this uniquely American style of growth. There was almost nothing down here in 1950 and 1960. It wasn't until air conditioning became common that people came down. It's brought my dad's family down here to do construction. And when my dad was a kid, even when I was a kid down here, there wasn't that much here, right? A lot of South Florida was still rural. All of this growth happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It just blew up. And it became essentially the American development paradigm on steroids, more than any other place, because it was all built during that time where this design paradigm prevailed. So you see it here because we've got more of it here.
Yeah. When I was reading it, I was imagining, I grew up in Houston, Texas, northeast of Houston. So Also a place that was developed after the 70s, right? Mine was a little different. I have a show coming out about it soon, and I talk about it a lot because it's like totally different from a lot of the other places. But there's 85 miles of greenbelt trails in this development, and I could get anywhere from one side to the other without crossing a major arterial because they designed in underpasses for the trail system.
Is that the Woodlands?
Kingwood.
Okay.
So Woodlands is on the left side and then Kingwood's on the right side. And actually, funny story, Ian McHarg designed the Woodlands, right? The original section of it anyways for George Mitchell. And the guys that designed Kingwood actually gave George Mitchell the name Ian McHarg to actually go and do that. So I have a whole episode coming out on it and I'm really excited to share it. There's really cool stories about that. It just makes me think of this like layered network that was created there, but wasn't created elsewhere. The autocentric kind of form took hold and then it dispersed everywhere. And so the Woodlands and Kingwood are actually outliers in that respect because of their trail systems, because of the way they were designed in the 70s, in the early 70s, partly during the oil crisis. Mm-hmm. And so you have this kind of why where some development in the United States just continued going along that way through the 80s and 90s. And then other countries like the Netherlands went a different direction. And so I find that fascinating too, is the directions that they went and which way we went. And we had some places that decided to go similar directions, but not quite. And we could have gone that way, but we just didn't learn lessons from them.
Yeah, it was, now the original model for suburbia, you go back to Clarence Stein and Radburn, and it had those exact features, but you're starting to strip things down in a for-profit Levittown kind of way where you're building in mass for the baby boom generation. The families are coming in, the GI generation's coming in. You start trimming out the things that cost a little extra in land development. So that model got lost.
Yeah.
But you'll still see the similar street thing. Even the most radical things that we take for granted now about Radburn, which is let's flip the house around, right? Houses before 1929 almost always faced the street. That was where it was. This is let's turn the back to the street. The street's inherently bad. The activity is going to be faced in the back. Now it's just the default model. And then you drive in to what is the front of your house.
The snout house.
Yeah.
Call it the snout house. Got a big garage up there.
There are still pockets where they get it right. And I live in a neighborhood that's like that too. But they're few and far between. That most of that other element that we need has been stripped out. But even still, that whole model sort of falls apart when you have to leave your community and access a grocery store.
Yeah.
Because the grocery store Woodlands has its town center, but I still imagine you leave to go on the arterial to access there it would be HEB.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. The Heb or Randall's.
Yeah.
It's also interesting because of those arterials and because of those commercial uses and the way that they developed, after you built this cell of a neighborhood, you'd have to have that place where people could go shopping. And that's part of it too. And your research, it was really interesting. On the 50 worst intersections, 36 of those were grocery or big box stores, which is a huge number and connects the dots so much for me personally.
Yeah, but every one of them had a drugstore, a fast food restaurant. They had at least one of these things there. There was something drawing every one of the 50, every single one. But yeah, the big box stores, and it would make sense. They're drawing the greatest number of people there. Like that's where the most activity is.
It's interesting too. We had Stacy Mitchell on the show recently, maybe like a year ago or so, talking about the proliferation of food deserts and how basically the food desert didn't exist before the 1980s, really. There was a lot of grocery stores and competition and everything. And lots of neighborhoods, even poor neighborhoods, had grocery stores. And then, basically the U.S., lots of things happened. The Motor Carrier Act happened. The Robinson-Patman Act stopped being enforced. A lot of things happened in suburban design and urban growth that led to a lot of subdivisions and things like that. But what's interesting about it to me is that we used to have these grocery stores and neighborhood retail that just really doesn't exist because of the consolidation of a lot of these larger companies, it feels like. And so the kind of growth and the hyper growth of some of these organizations like Walmarts and Targets and everything else, and their practices for where they site their buildings and the locations on arterials and large plots of land on the outside of town really do increase that exposure, increase that risk for people. And so that's part of the story too, I feel like.
Yeah. There are other things going on too. The corporatization of groceries, the building, and this is on the article as well. But an interesting that happened. So back in 1999, I was working with the New Jersey Office of State Planning, and the Central Ward of Newark was a food desert. They didn't have a single grocery store there. And so the state was doing a big job. We need to get these people a grocery store. We need to give them access to healthy food. You have all of these neighborhoods will have the little shop, the little sundry shop that will have junk food. They'll have the potato chips and then the pickled sausages, right? They'll have those things. But how do we get people access to healthy food? So they managed to get, I believe it was a Kroger that came in there. They were able to, through tax incentive, to get a Kroger come into Newark Central Ward. And within a year, it was the highest grossing per square foot Kroger of the entire thing because people didn't have access to it. So part of it might be that. Part of it might also be siting practices and discrimination about where we want to put groceries. Yeah, it's a complex issue. Now, the financial side of this is not one that I work with. So I'll leave that to the real estate people.
That's fair. That's totally fair. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, how hard would it be to pull these commercial uses off of the arterial roads and put them somewhere else that doesn't create as much conflicts, or design them in a way to start with that makes them all interior and you don't have as many people necessarily crossing these larger streets to get to them?
There's a couple ways to get at that. In my county, in Palm Beach County, in the northern part, you actually see some places that have done this. It's like downtown at Palm Beach Gardens, where when they built it internalized. They tried to build it sort of as a lifestyle destination where it's got one or two connections to the arterial system, but everything is internalized. That's one model. And that was, I mean, that worked when the US was a high growth country, which we're not anymore, right? Our population stabilizing. So the question, I think the challenge for us is we built all of this stuff. Now we own it, and what are we going to do with it? Now, if there's a silver lining to this cloud, is that most of the stuff that gets built is disposable, right? It was not built for generations. It was built for a financial model where the building wasn't meant to last. They would capitalize on their investment in the building in 15 years, then they walk away, right? So now you've got, and you'll see them in every metropolitan area. It's the strip mall that eventually has the vape shop and the dollar store, and it goes into decline and it goes into disrepair. We need to start thinking these places as land banks for redevelopment. Like, let's wipe that off. We've oversaturated, we've overzoned our arterials for retail. We don't have anywhere near the demand for the retail that we've permitted in our land use plans. So we need to start rethinking the land use plans for what are we going to do with this stuff when we don't have the demand that we used to, and where the infrastructure, the buildings that we have start to deteriorate. And this is where you have some exciting opportunities for redevelopment, right? Where we can start taking overlay districts, for example. New urbanists will do this a lot. New urbanists are big fans of the overlay district and the redevelopment plan. They're not doing it for safety, but we ought to be, right? If we start taking safety, we start integrating safety into traffic impact analyses, into site planning, right? It's not really integrated in any substantive way now into that, but we can start doing that. So we've built this first wave and the second wave of suburbia. What do we do is we start being forced to redevelop this. In South Florida, it's particularly pronounced because we're built out on Southeast Florida. We've got the ocean on one side and the Everglades on the other. And even in this state, politically, there's not a lot of public willingness to build any further west into the Everglades. So then it becomes, how do we reconfigure, how to rebuild the infrastructure and the cities and the environments that we have?
There was research recently that showed that despite their differences, California and Texas are on the same track in terms of development. And Texas is just catching up to what California already is in terms of, the housing prices and a lot of the things that are happening. And so, and it makes me, I've thought about this in my head for a while, but I think we're kind of like potted plants. We're hitting the edge of our pots in terms of like where we've grown and developed. And now we have to go inwards. But the problem with the inwards is that there's a lot of NIMBYs, there's a lot of kind of sclerotic growth in some of these neighborhoods that are older. And they might just need like a little bit of a shot in the arm to start thinking differently about how they can redevelop and be successful again, because there's no large tracts of land on the outside of these metropolitan areas anymore that can just build massive amounts of single family housing. And so if you can't build the same amount of housing, but you have the same kind of pressure and growth, what are you going to do? And so sometimes it is rethinking the places that you're talking about, rethinking these commercial spaces that have kind of been worn out. They're 20 years old. They're getting past their useful lives. They need to kind of switch. And unless we can do that, I think we might not be able to address some of the problems that we have with housing prices and a bunch of other things that are happening.
Yeah, the housing is a separate issue.
They're all connected though, right? It's separate from what you're looking at specifically, I know, but it is something that has to do with growth and how we put things together and then where we site things, right?
Yeah. But even still, I mean, my sense would be in a place like Houston, you're not land constrained, at least not to the western side. You can keep pushing out to the north and the west quite a bit further. I mean, here we're seeing it too. Here the growth is going up the eastern coastline.
Yeah.
Right. We've got people where I work that live an hour and a half away because housing, it's drive till you qualify.
Yeah. And that's a problem because that's a long drive. And so that's a lot of time spent in cars and away from your family and less access to jobs and a number of different things.
But where we struggle is, I live in Boca Raton, Florida, and it's occasionally there'll be some developer come in with a Q plan for workforce housing where there'll be a couple of units tossed in here or there. But there's no real effort to make anything affordable here. And the next town up, Delray Beach, they've got a very active affordable housing program, but they'll get in 50 units every now and again. And that's not really addressing the demand here. Building up in the north is, but then people drive.
Right.
So it's, I mean, when we start getting to that issue, that gets into a bigger, again, outside of my wheelhouse, but that gets into the bigger housing market, the secondary mortgage market, how we financialized housing in this country. That gets into a whole more complicated set of things.
Yeah, the risks from natural disasters and insurance and stuff adds on to that too. It's a fun conversation, but it all adds up. It all adds up. I have a quote here for you from your paper. Of the street design variables, only two proved to be significantly associated with the incidence of fatal and injurious crashes involving vulnerable users. Higher vehicle speeds were associated with significantly fewer of these crash types, while wider medians were associated with more.
Yeah, and it's two things to get at that. The wider medians was at intersection locations. Now, what we do with Florida is, the poster child for access management, which is to say, we try to channelize vehicles coming in and out of these driveways by putting in a raised elevated median in the middle of it. But to handle the turning maneuvers, we do turn lanes in that median. So the whole paved width of the median is going to be, 25 feet. But when you get to the intersection, 20 of those feet is going to be two turn lanes. So the median, those wide medians are going to be associated with more turn lanes. So with the wider medians, it was the introduction of turn lanes, which means the addition of traffic conflicts at those intersection locations, especially when you've got, as we still do, the permitted left turn, right? That puts that multiple threat in as people are trying to cross the adjacent street with the walk signal. Now, mid-block medians weren't a problem. Mid-block people do the staged crossing where they cross halfway the street, they're in the center line median, they're safe there, and then they do the second half of the crossing. The intersections is where the median's the problem. The speed one is also because of a confounding variable. So if the median is the result of turn lanes, the speed is the result of development. Because once you start seeing posted speed limits in excess of 40, 45 miles an hour, they don't have any development on either side of it. So once in Florida, once we start getting that development, the speed limit gets dropped to at most 45, even though we'll have suburban arterials that may be 50 or 55. But they only permit that when none of this development is there, right? So this is the high-end suburban stuff where the arterials themselves are fully access managed and landscaped, and there is no development on either side of it, right? It backs up to a subdivision that's heavily bermed, right? It's got a wall in the berm there that prevents traffic from getting through. The speed is getting at the land use issue too, indirectly. That makes sense? Traffic engineers get speed in a basic sense. Like they understand that where you've got development, speed is no good. But the pressure is 40 or 45. Or in the more areas, 35, 45, that band, you're going to see development there. But once you get above 45, you're not going to see it anymore. That's what's going on there. So that's stated another way in a more succinct way. It's related to speed limit setting practices. So the engineers, the Florida DOT, the counties will look at what's on either side of that right of way and determine whether or not, what speed is most appropriate for that environment. These aren't heartless people. They just like think it might be a little too fast.
It just makes you wonder about the development paradigm again, and just like, having arterial streets, they're basically a barrier, right, between two places, especially if you're walking and biking, right? Unless it's designed in a certain way where there's a way to cross or safely but they are higher speed, but also they are places where there is conflict. I mean, there's going to be people trying to cross at some points. Even if you have a berm in the back of your neighborhood, I know that like you're going to want to go to your friend's house in the other neighborhood that has a berm on the other side of the arterial. And so I think that seems like part of the issue too. Actually, I just released this morning a discussion with folks at Brown University about a paper called Community Severance, and they were looking at New York City, which is a totally different animal to a certain extent than South Florida. But at the same time, they found that the calculated community severance, which is like the barriers that arterial roads and traffic put up to people that keep them in their communities, and they found a higher incidence of schizophrenia in these areas outside of air pollution, right? They adjusted for the air pollution variable. And so it's really interesting to think about it from that perspective of like these roads are basically like big walls between each of these neighborhoods, and people are going to try to cross them because they want to get to the thing that's on the other side. And that's the land use aspect of it, right? And so I don't know how you mitigate that really if you're going to continue to build roads for cars or have to get people to get places in these kind of exurban and suburban environments.
Yeah, I mean, there's two pieces of this. The stuff that's already urbanized and it's already heavily used, your really only solution there is going to be a street design solution. You need to tailor the street design for that use. Here's the problem, though. We built 200,000 miles of urban arterial, right? That's like 3 times the interstate highway system, almost 4 times the interstate highway system. we're not rebuilding all of it. We can't even get a 2-mile light rail system built anywhere, right? Reconstructing the arterial system is not going to happen. At best, it's going to be a spot treatment for the worst locations. Not that we do that now. I mean, even our Vision Zero cities don't tend to prioritize the places where the problems are, because they're able to color every pedestrian improvement as a safety improvement. So they just stick it in the places where it'll make the wealthier folks happy. And certainly down here, we know where the high crash locations are in South Florida, right? That's not where we're putting the infrastructure in. But the solution here, we're not going to rebuild 200,000 miles of arterial. We're going to do spot treatments at specific locations. We need to be strategic about that. And it's often going to require us to focus on populations that don't get the attention they deserve. But the other solution is to reconfigure the stuff that's still adaptable. So the suburban, the ex-urban stuff that's in decline, wipe it out and reconfigure it. So it's going to be a two-pronged solution, the cheaper of which and the most pragmatic of which is going to be the redevelopment plan, because that's one that you can finance on the private sector, right? That's one that you can get developers to look at. There was an interesting study I did with a couple of colleagues, Tab Combs and Jesse Saganor. We were looking at safety and traffic impact analyses, and we did a panel with developers. And we wanted to see what developers thought about bringing safety considerations into site planning and design. They were all cool with it. Like, they had no problems with it. They understood how they could market it. What they said was, here's the problem. The problem is it doesn't come into the preliminary reviews. The problem is the planning department's going to start doing this ad hoc stuff afterwards. Like, if they could come in when we're doing our initial site plan and provide clear criteria for what to do, we're all about that. What we don't want to do is get jerked around in the site plan review process through various iterations, right? So if we can get our local governments to think about safety in a real way, and zoning ordinances don't think about safety at all. Subdivision regulations don't really think about safety either, other than on the residential street. There may be some consideration of, the signals at the intersections where they connect, but not really. If we can start bringing safety into this land use side, we've got an opportunity to make a real difference. Now, it's not a difference that we see tomorrow, right? It's a difference that we see in 20 years. It's a difference that our kids see, right? But when we do planning, we have to understand that we're, in theory, a future-oriented profession. We're not designing for tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. We're designing for 25 years, right? Where do we want to go and how do we get us there? And our land use plans, our land use regulations should do that, which means we need to bring safety in. A lot of the death and injuries that are happening today are the result of development decisions that happened 30, 40 years ago, right? It's somebody had a great plan for developing their community. Let's bring in the Walmart, right? That'll increase the tax base. Let's let them come in, right? Let's bring in the commercial on the arterial. It looks good on our tax base. Safety is not considered, right? The roads these were put in were perfectly safe until that development happened. So getting the land use plan to recognize that reality, that the consequences are going to come later, and being proactive about that, I think is the other real big piece of the puzzle here.
I mean, that's so important, the start of things instead of in the middle or the end of things. I mean, a lot of problems with transit construction and things like that are change orders and people changing their minds midway through and not, getting all this stuff done up front. We had Adele Houghton on talk about her book, Architectural Epidemiology. And she's like, well, if you start to figure out beginning before you even build any houses in a neighborhood, or if you're going to redevelop a house in the neighborhood, you need to start thinking about all the things that are going to be a problem for you. If you have a flooding problem, that's something that, a LEED certified house is not going to be solving for you specifically unless you take the steps to do it ahead of time. And so you're on the same path as her, which is like, you need to do all of these things and focus on like, what are the problems? How can we solve them? And then let's do this together at the start rather than changing it up halfway through or figuring out halfway through that you need, something else in your, HVAC system that will reduce the smoke from the fires that are going to happen or whatever it may be. But, whatever is impacting epidemiologically this neighborhood, how can we address that at the start rather than later on? And I think that's important part of what you're saying too, is like these site plans, the way that we do planning specifically, if we have safety in mind to start with, we can do it better later on, which is why I talk about my neighborhood all the time, that I grew up in Houston. I'm in San Francisco now, but where I grew up in Houston is like, I didn't know any better that this was a place that was safe for me, safer than all other places, suburban places. But it was planned like that to start with. They laid it out that way to start with, and it turned out that way. And so now it's, the dividends are, visible. 26 of 30 years from 1981 till 2010 or something like that, a school from the Woodlands or Kingwood won the state cross country championship. Why is that? Because the infrastructure that was laid down in these neighborhoods, in the largest schools. So there's an infrastructure, like it tells you later on, like what the benefits are. And so I think that's important, plan first, get the results later.
Yeah, but we also need to, and this is going to be a challenge too, which is it's not that we've just built this stuff, but then we put this extra layer of regulation over it that our traditional cities didn't have, right? So now you've got to fight a political battle with adjusting the zoning ordinance or figuring out the homeowners association.
Yeah.
Right. And that becomes, certainly with housing, that's a big challenge.
But if you do it before the homeowners association exists, you get a benefit from that, right? So I don't know. So what do you think going forward? Like, what's the next thing that you're going to look at given the findings from this report?
I'm actually going back to the beginning of the 20th century, because I think this is where we saw the fork between the United States and Europe, and our safety records divergence is about the decisions that we made about how we deal with the industrial city, right? So you have England, I like as an example. You have Ebenezer Hower, you have the Garden City. We understand that as a model for suburbia, but we don't necessarily understand it as also being a mechanism for social reform. Like, it was not just a housing solution, it was a problem to social insurance, health, retirement, all of these social ills. They went a specific direction with this. We brought that over here, and we integrated that with the automobile and with a very distinctly American notion of individualism and social responsibility. And it's because of that we took the big fork that we took. So I'm spending a lot of time looking at historical stuff right now at the very earliest stages of the planning profession. When we started doing, you had the original conferences of city planning, when these first people came together to talk about industrial reform and how that got deviated. And I think one of the big villains for road safety that we never even mention, but who looms over all of it, is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. Right? He's the guy that here in the United States, we came close to taking a social reform type of approach that they took in England, right? He derailed that and moved it into professionalism. Let's focus on forecasting. Let's focus on, site planning and design, and leave these other elements outside of it. So when we start getting these other notions of how we build a city all bundled together, you get the stuff that we have. All right. And it becomes problematic because of what we call path dependence, which is these institutions come into place for largely arbitrary reasons. It becomes very difficult to alter their trajectories. You're not going to find, for example, a single person planner in a metropolitan planning organization that says, oh, I want to build more suburban sprawl. But they're going to approve plan after plan that does that. Yeah. That's just the default in what they do. Like, we all talk a good game, but the institutions, the funding mechanisms, the decision processes, our analytical tools, our priorities are all aligned in this direction that was set 100 years ago, right? And breaking that down means understanding where the decisions we made, why we made them, and how to reorient that. So I've just been digging into a lot of historical stuff lately. And, I've spent up to my career now, it's all been data analysis and data crunching. And right now, the only data I'm looking at are page numbers.
How many books are you in?
Yeah, right. It stacks old reports. And to understand now, we need to understand why we made the decisions we made.
I was fascinated by Snyder's book, the way he talked about Euclid, right? And how that Supreme Court case basically changed a lot of things. And the case that he mentioned that led up to Euclid, and the court that actually sided the other direction, they were like, Americans expect change. And so, then we put the amber veil on top of all development by Euclid actually being ruled on by the Supreme Court. So, that period of time, there was a lot of whys and forks in the road that you could have gone in different directions. Another one that I was reminded of when you were talking is Yoni Applebaum's Stuck. And I don't know if you've read that one, but... he talks about actually earlier on than that, the land use kind of traditions of the North and the South. Northern United States had a land use tradition of collectivism. People were allowed to live in this small village where you were born and likely died. You weren't necessarily allowed to leave, but they took care of everything. They took care of your healthcare. You had a job. You had things that you were connected to, your society and your religion. Whereas in the South, it was very stratified. There was like rich and poor. The levels were very high, but they were also very low. And there's a lot of individualism, right? And so this collective idea and this individual idea from the North versus the South then bled into the rest of the country as this kind of weird thing where you're like, well, I should be able to tell you what you can do with your property from the North, and then nobody can tell me what I can do with my property in the South. And so this interesting kind of mismatch that ends up towards the predicament that we're in now with housing, but a bunch of other things, and it leads towards Euclid. good, and it leads towards a number of other things that got us here. So that's super fascinating that you're working on this.
Yeah, no, right now we're sort of tweaking at the edges of the problems of the system. Addressing speed limits is the edge of the problem, right? It's not to say that reducing speed limits isn't a good thing to do, but it doesn't really solve our problem. And if we were serious about it, if we wanted to address speed limits, every new production vehicle can read the speed limit.
Yep.
With cameras, and you can shut the speed down right now. Like NHTSA could solve this problem tomorrow if we cared. But that's the edge of the system. The question becomes is, why are we doing the things that we do, right? What is the core system itself? Yeah, it sounds like Yoni Applebaum's work is something that I would want to look at. What is the core of the system that we're really addressing? That's sort of, I think, where we're at. And I think we sort of have reached an end of doing the things we've done. Certainly the high growth phase of America is over. So now that we've eaten this big meal of development, now we can start digesting it, right? And the exciting things about cities is they are dynamic and they evolve, right? I mean, you look at maps of New Amsterdam, right, from 1600, and Wall Street is where the old wall was, right? They've got agriculture going on the back end of the wall. Now it's Skyscraper National Park, right? Cities evolve and they change. And for us, it's thinking about how we can harness these forces towards a better end. I think too often we're fighting about vehicle lanes. They don't matter, right? They don't really matter.
In the grand scheme of things, yeah.
We need to think broadly about the system. And it's exciting that, this work's going on. I think that's sort of where we need to be thinking now, which is we built it. Now, what are we going to do with it?
Yeah. I'm going to put this report in the show notes so folks can go and check it out and take a look. But Eric, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
Yeah, I edumbaugh@gmail.com. I'm employed at Florida Atlantic University, so I've got a faculty webpage there. They're welcome to call me direct, 404-429-6757. I still have my Atlanta phone number from when I was at Georgia Tech doing civil engineering.
Nice.
So, I think this is important stuff. And I think, here's the thing, like safety is an interesting thing because I think at a basic level, it bridges the political divide. I mean, everybody is interested in neighborhoods that are safe. We're all concerned about protecting our families and our children. And this is an opportunity, I think, where we can all sort of think about the things that we have in common and moving forward. So, yeah, the extent that I can help foster that conversation, I'm excited to do it.
I love it. And when the next one comes out, let me know. I'm super excited to read what you come up with.
Will do.
Awesome. Well, Eric, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire, published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 20-year-old newsletter as well and find everything else, including multiple ways to support the show, at TheOverheadWire.com. You can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.